should have had a song. I had a song, and then I closed my book, and I lost my song. So I'll find one.
While you're finding the song, I'll get my microphone.
950. 950. We'll sing the first and third verse of this, and ask Brother Joe Reeves to lead us in a prayer. 950. Your only Son, no sin to hide, but you have sent him from your side to walk upon this guilty sod and to become the Lamb of God. Oh, Lamb of God, sweet Lamb of God, I love the holy Lamb of God. Oh, wash me in his precious blood, my Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God. I was so lost, I should have died, but you have brought me to your side to be led by your staff and rod, and to be called the Lamb of God. Oh, Lamb of God, sweet Lamb of God, I love the holy Lamb of God. Oh, wash me in his precious blood, till I am just a Lamb of God.
Our precious and most holy Heavenly Father, it's kind of a blessing to be able to be here at this midweek service so that we can be around others of like precious faith, to build up our faith, and to learn more from your divine word. And Father, may we take what we hear tonight and apply it to our lives so that we can go out and be better Christians and have positive and Christian influences on other people. Father, we're grateful for all you've given us, this beautiful day that we've had, and the other material blessings that we all enjoy every day. Father, we ask that you be with those who are unable to be here because of sickness, those that have been suffering through surgeries and recuperating from surgeries, and those that are about to go in for surgeries. We ask that you watch over them and comfort them during this time. Be with those who grieve through the loss of loved ones. May they turn to you for the comfort they need while they're going through their grieving period. Be with Brother Edward as he delivers the lesson to upstairs class from the book of Matthew. May he continue to have a good and ready recollection of what he wants to say, not only for this lesson, but for many more to come. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Thanks to Eric and Joe for leading us in a song and prayer, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight, being a part of the midweek Bible class. Matthew chapter 19 will be the focus of our study tonight. Matthew 19. The book of Matthew is a very important book. It is the introductory book of the New Testament. It brings us to that period of time wherein John comes on the scene, Jesus shortly thereafter, and the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies have been fulfilled in that, and then Matthew delves into the ministry of our Lord, wherein he did many wonderful miracles, showing that he was indeed the Son of God, and then also delivered several main discourses in the book of Matthew. You'll find that in the first few verses of Matthew 19, there is a shift of locations again. We have traced those throughout. But let's read the first 12 verses of the chapter, which will serve as the focus of our study tonight. And it came to pass that when Jesus had finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came into the coast of Judea beyond Jordan. And great multitudes followed him, and he healed them. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said unto them, Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain or two shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. They say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? And he said unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. His disciples said unto him, If the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. But he said unto them, All men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs who were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able, receive it, and let him receive it. That passage, when read today, always captures attention because of the subject matter. And, well, it should, because our world today is beset with some of the same problems that the Jewish world was in Jesus' day. We'll talk about some of those things as we go through. Notice it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings. You'll notice that statement several times in the book of Matthew, and it always denotes a shift. You're going to be moving to another area, going to be another situation arise. He departed from Galilee, we're told, and came into the coasts of Judea beyond Jordan. Now that statement beyond Jordan is very important. He is going to the eastern side of the Jordan. He has been up in Galilee, and many of the Jews, when they came down from Galilee, would cross over the Jordan into this area too far to not have to go through the land of the Samaritans. Jesus, you'll remember, did go through Samaria on occasion, but on this occasion, he crosses to the eastern side into an area, though it's not called this in the Bible, into what was known as Perea. And this, in some Bibles, will be described as the Perean ministry. So he goes into that area and finds people following him, and he heals a lot of those people who are ill and so on. Great multitudes followed him, and he healed them. But this calls attention to the fact that Jesus would go into areas where some people would not. Now, they would call this Transjordan years ago. Perea is from a Greek term that means over or to cross over. And so that was what this little body was called, a body of land was called there. Today, this and a whole lot more land makes up the nation of Jordan. Simply called Jordan today, as we would say. But sometimes you'll find it's called Transjordan. It's interesting that Herod Antipas was the ruler of this area. It's an area between the rivers of Yarmuk and Arnon. If you look on a map, you'll see the river Yarmuk coming into the Jordan, and then down south of it, Arnon will come in. And that is the area where this is taking place. You'll remember that Herod Antipas was the man who was rebuked by John the Baptist because of his unlawful marriage to his brother Philip's wife, a woman with the name of Herodias. And so it makes you wonder if these Pharisees who come along are not trying to set Jesus up and to get him into maybe the limelight to where he will be on record as saying something that might just irritate Herod Antipas, who might then kill Jesus just like he did John. Now, that is just, I'm not trying to conjecture or get into supposition, but when you study the book of Matthew and other texts about the Pharisees very carefully, you find that they would be capable of doing something like that. And knowing the background from earlier studies in the book of Matthew, you can see that this is developing. They were constantly trying to get Jesus in a position where they would have reason to get rid of him. And so what better way to get rid of him than to stir up trouble over there in Perea and let old Herod Antipas take care of it, because he had already proven that he could do that. So these people were coming to Jesus not to find out the truth and factual information, because they came tempting him. Some translations use the word testing from a word that would allow either interpretation. Now, look at the question that they pose in view of the situation earlier studied about Herod and Herodias. And if you remember, when we studied the situation about John and his rebuking Herod Antipas, we noted that the language used denotes that it was not a one-time rebuke. He rebuked him evidently more than once. And it was more than his wicked wife could take. And so the things began to develop that caused John to lose his life. Notice, if you will, in verse 3, the question asked, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? I believe the New American Standard Version says for any cause at all. I mentioned earlier that divorce was very common in that time period. In fact, it had become so casual, or men had become so casual about it, that they would put away their wives for very trivial matters. You've heard people say that, they would put away their wives for burning the biscuits. Well, that's actually the case. If she did not cook to suit him, he could put her away. Or go to Hardee's, I guess. But something like that. But just the least little matter, if she embarrassed him in public, he could put her away. Now, there's some men that need to be embarrassed in public. But that just goes to show you that they were looking for something. They knew the tendencies and all of that. But when you study Jesus' response, as we're going to attempt to do, he certainly did not advocate divorce, did he? And he did not command it. You notice they said, why did Moses command? That was really a misrepresentation of what the law taught. But they so interpreted it. Jesus rather shows the evil effects of divorce. And I'd say there's not a person in this audience tonight that doesn't understand that, because all of us have maybe a family member, somebody that has been devastated by divorce. And I always like to point out that always understand Jesus is not condemning innocent people. That's not what this is about. He is talking about people being responsible and fulfilling their God-given responsibilities in reference to marriage. God, I guess you could say, reluctantly permitted divorce in certain situations under the Old Testament system. But Jesus goes back beyond that. Moses did not command it. The law did not command it. But it was permitted in order to perhaps protect women, because divorce in the Jewish system was primarily a matter that pertained to the man. He had the right to put his wife away under certain situations. The women did not have that right. Now, when you come into some areas, for example, in some of the Herodian family, the sister of Herod the Great, who was the father of Herod Antipas and Philip and all those guys that you've heard us talk about, there was a case where Herod the Great's sister sued her husband for divorce. But that was, the Herod family, the Herodian family, had been really influenced by Greek and Roman culture. And Josephus comments that though she did that, the Jews did not agree with it. And they would not allow that. Her name happened to be Salome. And she had a quarrel with some fellow whose name I can't pronounce. But she sent him a bill of divorcement and dissolved her marriage. But the Jewish laws were not in accord with that. Later, Josephus would write, and this is a quote, "Herodias took upon her to confound the laws of our country and to divorce herself from her husband while he was alive, and was married to Herod Antipas, her husband's brother by the father's side," that is, on the father's side. Now that's a quote from Josephus, a Jewish historian who was not a Christian. But this coincides beautifully with the things that happened. Now if you read 1 Corinthians 7, it seems to imply in 1 Corinthians 7, 12 and 13 that both men and women in that culture would be able to put people away. But that statement, for any reason at all, is very, very helpful or very interesting to study. The King James has for every cause, any cause at all, just whatever. And we know that that did not accurately represent what God wanted. They were not asking if it was permissible to divorce. They already assumed that it was. The major question they're asking is, what about the grounds for divorce? That's the question that they're primarily asking here. Is there just any reason will that do when it comes to granting a divorce? And Josephus commented on that. He said a husband could give his wife a certificate of divorce for any cause whatsoever. And then he added this comment, many such causes happen among men. So that tells us that divorce was very common. And it's interesting to study that and view that against the backdrop of the book of Malachi, where Malachi writes in chapter 2, God hates putting away. And we're about 400 years removed from that. And you have this divorce explosion, I guess you could call it, much as we have in our culture today. There were two views among the Jewish rabbis. Both of them based their views on Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. And one of these schools was directed by Shammai, Shammai. And he was the more conservative rabbi. He believed that the indecency of which Deuteronomy 24 speaks was adultery. And it was only upon the grounds of adultery that one could get a divorce. The other one, the more liberal of the two rabbis, was Hillel, Hillel. And he taught that indecency in the woman or the wife was anything that displeased her husband. Now that is very, very liberal, isn't it? To take the position, if there's anything at all, my wife, that displeases me, then I can divorce her. You can see what that would do to the family. When you go back and read the Genesis account, it's very evident that God intended the marriage relationship to be permanent. He did not make two men or two women. And one writer points out that it clearly shows that polygamy or polyandry, where you have, multiple wives and all of that, if that was the very best order, why didn't God make one man and a whole bunch of women? Or vice versa. It's evident that he meant for the relationship upon which civilization would be based would be a family consisting of a man, a woman, and offspring. You have to have those two in order to biologically produce offspring. And God's way has been proven to be the best over and over again. In verse 4, Jesus began to answer the question, and here's what he said. Have you not read? That is such a simplistic answer, but it is such an important one. Have you not read? Take your concordance sometimes and run the references on that. Look up the word read and just notice how many times this question is posed. Have you not read? In this book alone, chapter 12, verse 3, chapter 21, verse 16, verse 42 of that same chapter, chapter 22, verse 31. He tells us, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And they were called man or mankind. A male and a female. Genesis 1:27 in the Septuagint version, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. You can emphasize that last statement and get the sense of the original there. In Genesis 5, verse 2, he created them male and female. He blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. There you go again. Clearly showing male and female. The male and female complement and complete one another. If you study Genesis 2, 18 through 24, the original design was to be that model for all future sexual unions, male and female. That is God's will for mankind. John Chrysostom, I'm not real familiar with him, but I remember his name coming up in Bible classes and so on, and references given to him. Chrysostom wrote this: if it had been his will that he should put this one away and bring in another, when he had made one man, he would have formed many women. End of quote. That's a pretty reasonable and logical conclusion to come to. God's intention and design clearly excluded same-sex unions that are very common today. Very, very common. I was reading just the other day of a particular woman. I did not know that much about her, but evidently she was some sort of celebrity. And she and another woman were both described as being the wives of the other. Sometimes there will be one that is viewed as fulfilling the husband's role and another one fulfilling the wife's. But that is all far unto the Scriptures. It's condemned in Romans chapter 1. And when we start tampering with God's purposes, then disaster usually comes, doesn't it? Look at verse 5. Jesus next cites Genesis 2:24. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The relationship between a husband and a wife outweighs all other relationships. Now, we love our children. I may have told you about this before. Years ago, we had a discussion in a Bible class when I was only probably 9, 10, 11 years old. Ben Flatt's sister was in that class, Jimmy Birdwell and Kenneth Kirby probably, and I can't remember everybody. We had a discussion about if a man and woman were to fall, and a child, one of their children, was to fall into the river. If you were the husband, which one would you save first? Now that was a deep philosophical and theological question for us to be pondering. There was some who said, I would save the child because the child could not be saved. There were others who said, but the child would be saved if it died. So I would save my spouse if I could. Because my first and foremost responsibility is to my spouse first. Now, I don't know if we could follow up on that. I think most women would say, honey, I'm hanging on, you go get the baby, you know. Or, you know, I think the husband and wife both would probably respond that way. But what I'm trying to emphasize is the husband-wife relationship is a very, very strong relationship. Look at that leaving and cleaving principle as it's stated in the King James Version. A man must leave his parents and cleave to his wife. Be joined to is the idea. And we're told that the word leave is translated in the Greek versions from a word that means to give up. Now, you don't just turn your back on your parents because, you know, the New Testament teaches us and the entire Bible teaches us that we're to do our best to take care of our needy parents and to demonstrate care for them. But we are to grow up. Have you ever known a marriage that floundered because the husband couldn't leave mom and daddy, or the wife couldn't leave mom and daddy? Doesn't mean you don't love them, but your primary responsibility is interfered with because you keep hanging on. We need to remember that. The word for cleave or be joined originally meant to glue or to cement together. Now, that's a strong term, isn't it? So the oneness is physically expressed in the sexual union, as seen in 1 Corinthians 6:16 and chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. Based on the creation in verse 6, Jesus gave this charge: what therefore God has joined together, let not man separate or put asunder, as the King James says. The word joined together literally means yoked together as a team. And isn't that one of the major problems in many marriages today? The two are not a team. There's an old cartoon that I have somewhere back in my files. Hadn't seen it in a long time. I saw it many years ago in Bulletin Digest. Two mules are standing there looking, they're still harnessed together, looking at a pile of hay. And then they spot another pile of hay. One decides, I'm going to eat this one. The other one decides, I'm going to eat this one. And they're pulling and tugging at one another. Finally, they figure it out. The next frame shows both of them eating this pile of hay, and when it's gone, the next frame shows them eating this other pile of hay. They learn to work together. And we have got to learn to work together in marriage too. When you look at this statement, what therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. Who is a man to try to tear apart what God has joined together? A writer by the name of R.T. France, thinking about that, said, to see divorce as man undoing the work of God puts the whole issue in a radically new perspective. It does, doesn't it? I closed the lesson Sunday morning, you'll remember, by asking, will a man rob God? You think about a man who was created by the Almighty God, thinking that he could get away with robbing his Creator. Now that causes us to stop and think, doesn't it? Or it should anyway. And the same thing is true here. Verse 7, we've already talked about, why did Moses command to give a writing or a certificate of divorce and send her away? And we know that that was not the case. And then in Matthew, or in verses 8 and 9, hurriedly, he said, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Matthew verse 9 says, and I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her, which is put away, doth commit adultery. Brother Glenn Colley made an excellent point on this verse. People have tried every way in the world to get around it, to twist it, to change it, to take out the exception, just to ignore the exception, whatever. But he said, I've gotten to the point where when people ask me, well, I read what it says. What does it mean? He said, it means what it says. And so just read it again and again and again. And we realize that Jesus is saying something that churches of Christ have emphasized for years, for centuries. Let's go back and restore. Restore the church? Yes. Restore the plain, simple plan of salvation? Yes. What about restoring marriage as God wants it? That's something to think about, isn't it? A lot of children back there fixing to come in that door, and that's one of the reasons that homes need to be what God wants them to be. Thank you for your good